Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the plant-based umami class. My name is Chef Emily. This is the Chef Peter X. Kelly Teaching Kitchen here at New York-Presbyterian Hudson Valley Hospital. And I'm so grateful that you joined me this afternoon on this beautiful day to talk a little bit about umami. What is umami? How do you get it into your meals? Why do we like it so much? And what's all the talk about this umami and how to use it. I'm mostly focusing on plant-based recipes today. So I'll talk a little bit about just exactly what that means. And then just a few Zoom ground rules. Keep yourselves muted throughout our presentation. If you have questions, we have our wonderful moderator, Alita, joining us to read me your questions if anything comes up. So thanks so much for tuning in again and for continuing to come back to these classes. It's always good to see all your familiar faces and names popping up. So thank you. So umami, what is umami? Umami is our fifth taste receptor. So everybody knows sweet, sour, bitter, and salty. Umami is the fifth taste receptor. It's essentially the meaty flavor of food. Why do we like it so much? Because it actually lingers in the mouth longer than other flavors, and it promotes salivation. So that's one of the reasons for which we like it so much. It makes us drool. So that's really good for digestion. And it's found in foods that contain high levels of glutamate. So glutamate is a naturally occurring amino acid, and there are higher concentrations of glutamate in certain foods, which is why they have a stronger umami taste. So some plant-based sources of umami, usually when you say umami to someone, they immediately think, grilled steak, barbecue, something like that, right? So the rich, meaty kind of flavor. But there are really wonderful plant-based sources where you can include this into your diet and still get that layered flavor and depth in your recipes without the meat. So that's what I'm going for here today. So plant-based sources include things like tomatoes, a beautiful, perfectly ripe tomato, mushrooms, really, really high in glutamate, which makes them really umami dense. And then there's also miso paste, seaweeds, green tea actually has small amounts of glutamate and has that umami flavor as well. Some of you may be familiar with what's called nutritional yeast. I'll talk a little bit more about exactly what that is and how to use that. Other sources include onions, asparagus, soy sauce, broccoli, peas, beets, olives, capers, and some of you may be familiar with Marmite. It's typically found in Australia, but you can find it here as well. It's like a yeasted product as well. So a lot of fermented and yeasted things, and those are high in these glutamates. One note about umami: aging and ripening increases the amount of glutamate in foods. So this is really interesting, right? That's why ripe tomatoes taste so much better than a tomato that's not very ripe, because it's ripened, so it's had the glutamate developing, which makes us salivate and makes us enjoy the food even more. So ripe tomatoes taste better. Dried mushrooms are actually more flavor dense than fresh mushrooms. And then fermentation increases the amount of glutamate in foods as well, which is why things like miso and soy sauce have that really strong, rich umami flavor, because they're both fermented. Do we have any questions about that before I jump into our cooking demonstration?
So there's a question about finding miso. Denise says, where do you find yours?
Yeah, miso it's something you have to journey for. It's a little bit tricky to find in just your regular supermarket, but I'm hoping that will change. I certainly encourage you to talk to store managers. If you go to a store every week and you're looking for miso, and then you tell all your friends to also look for miso, eventually stores are going to pick up on that and they're going to start bringing you miso. But locally, I know Cold Spring at Marbled, the meat shop in Cold Spring that's on Route 9, they have miso. And then you can probably also find it at, I think it's called Apple Farm. I'm not too sure about that, but I know this is a very active, chatty community. So if anybody has seen miso, please tell us where to find it. I often get mine from Marbled Meat Shop. So thank you, Alita. Any other questions or comments?
No questions, but there's a comment
Okay.
about the H Mart has it. This is the one
Yeah.
up in
Oh,
Hart
yeah,
today.
of course.
Trader
Yeah.
Joe's. Some of the local supermarkets have it. They usually have just one kind.
Mhm.
But something like Whole Foods has a variety of different ones.
Yes,
So
absolutely. Whole Foods. Yeah. And
they,
miso is traditionally made from soybeans, but if you have a soy allergy, there are other misos out there. There are some that are made from chickpeas. There's some that are made from azuki beans. So different, it can be made from any kind of bean because miso essentially is just a fermentation process. Yeah. Thank you, Alita.
you're
All
welcome.
right.
That's it.
Yeah. Anything else?
No, just that also Nature's Pantry and Fishkill. They
Mm.
also have miso.
Right. And I'm sure the Beacon Health Food Store as well. I think that one's called Nature's Pantry too. So we're going to jump into our recipes. We're going to layer in umami all the way up the chain. So our first recipe is going to be a creamy mushroom pasta. We're going to start by boiling our pasta. I rarely make pasta, but I found this really good whole wheat linguine. I'm not a huge fan of whole wheat pastas, but I know that whole wheat is so much better for us because it has a complete fiber. So what I found though is that the linguine shape, I'm much less bothered by the whole wheat taste than if I'm working with like farfalla, like the butterfly or the spirals or anything like that. Those whole wheat pastas I find just to be just a little too aggressive in their whole wheat taste. But the linguines, I don't mind it at all. So if you've sworn off whole wheat pasta, give it another chance with either a spaghetti or a linguine shape and see what you think. So I'm going to start by getting this into our boiling liquid over here. And so you'll notice in this recipe, something a little unusual. I'm not boiling this pasta in just water. I'm boiling this pasta in mushroom broth. So you can see here, this is the mushroom broth that I'm using, right? And so I have about 3.5 cups in here, and then I've added water to this pot as well. So you can boil your rice in mushroom broth. You can boil your pasta in mushroom broth. Any of the grains that you're cooking, feel free to cook them in a stock or a broth. It's going to give them so much flavor because they're going to absorb all of that as they're cooking. So this is sort of a fun way to layer in umami from the very beginning. You're also not necessarily going to need to add a ton of salt to your water because a lot of these broths, this one included, has salt in it already. So often whenever I'm cooking pasta that's, just in water, you want to salt the water to make sure that the pasta is flavorful. But when you're cooking it in broth, you don't necessarily have to because the broth has a lot of salt already. So it was boiling. I added the pasta in. And I'm just kind of moving it around a little bit until it comes back up to a boil, starting to steam. So that's good. And then over here, I'm just going to get my pan heated while I get my mushrooms ready. Any questions, Alita, about that?
No questions, just that the whole wheat pasta tip was a good one. So thank you.
Yay. Oh, good. Yeah, I really, this was like a game changer for me because I love pasta, but I married an Italian, so pasta has to be a part of our lives. It's not an option. So exactly. So at least the whole wheat linguines, I'm like, good. At least we're getting some good fiber in there. So I want to introduce you to my umami friend, Powerhouse. Everybody knows this by now, probably. This is a shiitake mushroom. You can see how the gills are very tightly packed. So whenever you're working with shiitake mushrooms, you just want to brush any dirt off. I got these ones at the supermarket, so they were like very clean. They really didn't need any brushing or anything at all. I guess that's the advantage of sterile supermarket environments. There's no dirt. So you have these cleaned mushrooms. And if you were working with mushrooms from the farmer's market, beautiful, fresh, full of flavor, feel free to get a little damp cloth and brush them. Or if you can be really, really swift about it, you can fill a bowl with water, quickly dip the mushrooms, shake, shake, shake. Should take no more than 3 seconds. Lift them out and put them in another bowl. So that's another way to just quickly get all the dirt to fall to the bottom. So I'm going to start by trimming the stems. Shiitake mushroom stems are edible. And if you wanted to, you could save all of your stems and add them to some water and let that boil for about 30 minutes or so. Strain the stems out and then cook your pasta in that. Could be a great way to save the stems, and you kind of create your own mushroom broth that way. So here we have our mushroom caps. I'm just going to start by curling my fingers and rolling right across the top of that shiitake mushroom. Of course, you can use different varieties of mushrooms. If you have maitake, or what else do I really like to use? Cremini is really good too. The portobello ones, which are really big, they tend to give off a lot of liquids, so those are good too, but just keep in mind that your sauce may be a bit saucier because they give off a lot of juice. Shiitakes are really kind of dense and a little bit drier, so I think maybe that's why I find their umami flavors to be a little more concentrated. So I just chopped those up. We're going to get those going in a pan. I'm using some olive oil today. So very, very simple saute with these mushrooms. Whenever you're cooking mushrooms, get the biggest pan that you have, the biggest, roomiest pan, so that you can put the mushrooms in one layer and cook them until they're nicely browned. That's because umami flavor is further developed with browning. So that's another trick for your umami, put in your umami sleeve. So we have the mushrooms. We're gonna get some oil in there, and right away we're gonna get those mushrooms down. And again, I just wanna go in one layer in the pan. I don't wanna go, I'm gonna put these off to the side. I don't wanna go too, I don't wanna fill the pan up too much, because then the mushrooms will steam instead of, nicely browning. So we're just going to add a little oil on top. And keep in mind, whenever you're working with mushrooms, they do this thing that makes you think, oh my gosh, there's not enough oil in the pan, right? Because they'll go in there, they'll immediately soak everything up, and then only after a few minutes of being exposed to heat, they'll start to release their juices. So you end up thinking, oh my gosh, there's not enough oil in the pan, when really the mushrooms have just soaked everything up, and they're gonna start releasing stuff soon. All right, so I have my strainer set up here in the sink. So when I'm ready to get that pasta out, right, you want to work quickly so you don't have, have a situation in which your pasta overcooks. There's no overcooked pasta allowed in my house. It's al dente only, which is a really interesting thing about pasta that I learned is the same thing with like potatoes. When they're served cold, they have what's called a resistant starch, which like inhibits their, it basically makes it so that they're less caloric, which I don't really know how that works, but it's interesting. The same thing for pasta. When it's al dente, it develops what's called a resistant starch, which the body doesn't fully absorb. So you end up not having as much. So it's something I'm researching and kind of looking into, because it's a really interesting phenomenon, and I hope to have more information to you soon in my culinary inquiries. So I'm just getting these browned. In the meantime, we're going to get our garlic ready. So I have 3 cloves of garlic. Just going to give them a light pressing. You can always use a jar or your minced garlic from the refrigerator if you already have that. Of course, I like the fresh stuff best. It is really a nice flavor, especially with mushrooms. You could add a little wine to this recipe. I left it out because we're going to use mushroom broth instead. But if you wanted to, saute your mushrooms. And if you notice, I am not moving those mushrooms. I put them in and they are sitting and searing. They have not moved once, right? Because I want them to have good contact with the pan. When I start to smell a little bit of browning and that umami richness kind of developing, and maybe you're smelling it and you start to drool, salivate a little bit, that's a good sign. That means that the umami flavors are growing. So I'm just going to start by slicing this garlic, but once they start to smell that way, you can give them a quick stir, and then you can, of course, let them sit and sear on the other side. So I don't really worry about, each one getting some exposure to the pan on each side. That would be very labor intensive if I decided that I needed to flip each mushroom. So I just let them sit and sear, maybe rotate the pan a little bit to get the even heat distribution, give it a stir, and just let it sit and sear some more. All right, so this is really, really simple. Sauteing your mushrooms, developing their umami flavor. Okay, so we've got the garlic ready. We've got some beautiful red pepper flakes. We're going to add those in there for some flavor as well. So this is simple but layered, right? You've got the mushroom broth. We're going to cook until that broth is pretty well absorbed. And we're also going to add broth to the mushrooms as well. So once they've kind of browned on both sides, add the broth. Then we're going to add a little bit of heavy cream at the end. So we're just using a regular dairy heavy cream. But before we do all that, since these now have a little bit of nice browning on them, I'll bring this closer so you guys can see. Right, you can see they're starting to brown nicely. And if you can just imagine what they smell like, right? They've got that kind of almost like a popcorn smell to it, like umami popcorn. That sounds really good, actually. So we're gonna add our garlic. We'll add our red pepper flakes. Stir those around just for a minute or so. Get some heat on that garlic. This pan is, it doesn't have a flat bottom. It's kind of rounded. I don't know how that happened. Just kind of appeared in the kitchen that way. But as a result, it's very tippy. So I always have to kind of be mindful of how I'm moving things around. All right, we've got the heat in there. We've got the red pepper flakes, the mushrooms, red pepper flakes, garlic, oil, and we're going to add our mushroom broth next. Any questions before I do that? I think I saw something pop up.
There's a question about the nutritional benefit of umami, or is it the same as each source?
So the nutritional benefits of umami, it's not necessarily that umami is highly nutritious for you, but it does promote salivation, which is really good for digestion. And then of course, each food, miso, mushrooms, tomatoes, they all have their own, special effects, so to say. So shiitake mushrooms, for example, are really low in calories. They're high in B vitamins. They contain a good amount of selenium and zinc as well, as potentially may help lower cholesterol. They have what are called sterols, these naturally occurring molecules that help to block cholesterol absorption in your gut. So they're kind of miraculous. They have these beta glucan fibers as well, and those can also potentially help to lower cholesterol. So a great thing about shiitake mushrooms and many Asian varieties of mushrooms is they may boost your immune system. And mushrooms are one of the only plant sources of vitamin D as well. So there's a lot of good things in there. Although the mushroom vitamin D is D2 and not D3. So D3 is the superior form of vitamin D. Also, the vitamin D levels depend on how they're grown. So if they're grown in the wild, where they're exposed to lots of sunlight and UV rays, they develop more vitamin D. So that's one example of, a food that is umami rich and also has good things in it for you. Any other questions?
Yes, there's a question here. It says, is salivating for desserts still good for digestion?
Great question. Yeah, I mean, any kind of salivation, it promotes you produce salivary amylase, which helps to digest carbohydrates in particular. So I'm going to add this mushroom stock. Then we're going to whisk in some heavy cream, salt, and pepper. I want to add that and let the mushrooms really fully absorb that flavor. So it's going to look a little bit wet, and then it's going to get dried up again because the mushrooms are going to soak it all up. And I turn this down, it's a pretty low heat right now. So just let everything soak up. Okay, and then we're gonna add, again, I'm using just regular heavy cream. You don't need a lot, just a few tablespoons. We're gonna whisk that in. Let's add, I forgot a little salt to this and some fresh pepper as well. So you're on your way to a delicious pasta night here. All right, let's check on our noodles over here. They're getting nice and soft, almost done. I have a timer on them. And then the last thing we're going to be adding to this as well is some fresh parsley. And I like to add a little lemon juice at the end just for some added vitamin C. I just wanted to show you how I'm storing my herbs. This is a brown paper towel and it is damp. And this is fresh parsley from the garden today, so I didn't need to store it. And then this is our parsley from the garden last week that I wanted to use up. But I just wanted to show you, you know, even 1 week in this paper towel kind of storage method, and this parsley is still looking really quite fresh. So, so you can kind of find the bigger leaves and pick them off, or if you want, you can also just kind of cut where the stems are, get rid of the biggest, stemmiest parts, and then bunch up the rest of it and do a little parsley mince to get that in there. We got to add some form of greens into our dish, right? Even if it's just parsley. Any other questions? Everybody's going to be making mushroom pasta tonight, I hope.
Yeah, there is a question. If you use wine, would you use the same amount as the broth? And could you use any kind of wine?
So if you use wine, you can use the same amount as the broth. The only thing I would say is use a white wine. It's better with the mushrooms. The red wine, I find, tends to be overpowering. It's more of a taste thing. And don't use cooking wine, please, whatever you do. It's so salty. It's really no good. Just use a cheap kind of drinking wine, something that's palatable, because you want your food to be palatable. Yeah. All right. We're going to add our cream. Put that in there. Our parsley. Stir everything up. And then I'm going to drain this pasta, but I'm going to save a little bit of the cooking water because it's going to help to kind of make a sauce for this. All right, let's scoot this back. All right, it's been about 10 minutes on this. Oops, this is this one. So you can always take out a noodle, give it a little test and see. With this, I like to run it under cold water so you don't burn yourself. So it's always helpful. And then you can always use your nail to kind of clip and check inside. So this is completely cooked. I don't think you can see that. It's so tiny. But usually if it's not completely cooked, you'll see a little tiny white dot in the middle. So just look out for that. And then of course you can always just take a bite and taste it. That's a great way to make sure that it's cooked as well. So I'm gonna save a cup of the cooking liquid. So I like to just take my measuring cup and kind of dip it in. Might get a noodle or two, but that's okay, right? And then we'll put this off to the side and drain the rest. Okay, nice and easy. If you wanted to add spinach to this recipe, just to add even more greens, one thing that you can do is you can grab those spinach leaves, chop them up, or even just tear them up or leave them whole if they're baby spinach, and then put them at the bottom of your colander, pour the hot water and noodles over it, and that will just, you know, kind of wilt your spinach, and you don't need an extra anything to cook it. All right, so in it goes. We have some tongs here, which are going to help us to move this around and get everything all sauced up. If you're looking for a completely vegan recipe without the heavy cream, you can leave the heavy cream out. You don't have to have it in there. So you can just add a little more, you know, mushroom broth or white wine, any kind of liquid. And, you know, that'll still be really, really flavorful. So I'm just kind of moving this around, adding just a touch of that cooking liquid. So if you know anything about cooking pasta, as it cooks, it starts to release its starch. And that starch is really, really helpful whenever you're trying to make a sauce and kind of thicken your sauce a little bit. So this is it. This is done. So we're going to make our own dairy-free Parmesan. And I'm going to show you how to do that next. Any questions about this recipe?
No
Show
questions.
everybody what it looks
Questions
like.
yet.
Okay, so there it is. You can see the pasta's cooked through. The mushrooms are beautiful everywhere. They look great. I'm going to transfer this to a bowl because if you leave your pasta in the hot dish, and I see this happen all the time, it's going to keep cooking, right? And you don't necessarily want to keep cooking your pasta because then it's going to just be too mushy. Okay, so always transfer to another container. I know it makes for another dish to clean. It's always easier when you can just serve things straight from the pot, right? But you can see here, at least this is, you know, this is gonna be served, would be served right away. And then you can also garnish that with a little squeeze of fresh lemon juice just to add a little bit of acidity and tartness to this. Optional on the lemon. I love lemon on almost everything. Any other questions before we go to our cheese?
Yes, there's a question. Could you replace the cream by blending some of the mushrooms?
Interesting. I suppose if you wanted to, yes, you could take some of the cooked mushrooms, like make extra cooked mushrooms and toss them in a blender with a little bit, maybe like some cashews or something like that. That could be interesting. Yeah, that could be interesting. Why not? Even more umami, I'm all about it. Okay, anything else before we make our cheese?
No, that's it. Chef Emily, there are some really good nut creamers as well available that are unsweetened. So
yeah, thank you, Alita. Yeah, you're our vegan expert in residence. So definitely a lot of really great dairy-free creamers are out there. I've also accidentally bought the ones that are sweetened, and oh my goodness, don't make that mistake.
Right.
So they're really, really sweet. So Alita, do you have any ones in particular that you enjoy that are unsweetened dairy-free creamers, and where do we find them?
So, the ShopRite on Route 6, they have a nice assortment. You just have to make sure that you look and that it says unsweetened. Otherwise, you can Google how to make creamers. You could do it with almonds, with cashews, and you make your own without adding anything to it, and it's fresh. And the more cashews you put, the thicker it will be.
The thicker it is. You also just gave me an idea, Alita, that you could use your hemp seeds. So if you guys have hemp seeds, go ahead and blend some of those up with some water, keeping it fairly thick, so it gets really, really creamy, and then you can probably use that as well. Yeah, that's a really fun idea. I'm going to try that. All right, so we're going to go ahead and make the vegan Parmesan, and this is very, very simple. We're going to be using raw cashews. So I have, here they are, not soaked, nothing added to them, not roasted or anything. We're going to be adding nutritional yeast. Now, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about nutritional yeast because I get a lot of questions about what exactly is this stuff, right? It smells really good. It smells a bit like, smells like Parmesan, really. It's a species of yeast that is, I can't pronounce the full name of this species, but it's the same type of yeast that's used to bake bread and brew beer, but it's very different. So nutritional yeast is grown specifically to be used as a food product. The yeast cells are killed during the manufacturing, so they're not alive in the final product like they would be for beer or bread yeast. It's used culinarily to give things a cheesy, nutty taste. And to produce it, essentially these cells are grown for several days. Then they're deactivated with heat. They're harvested, they're washed, they're dried, they're crumbled, they're packaged, and then they show up in your grocery store like this. So there are two types of nutritional yeast. There's fortified and unfortified. The unfortified ones do not contain any added vitamins or minerals. So if you see something that's unfortified, it's just the yeast, no vitamins or minerals are added to it. And then something that's fortified, like this one is, you can see on the back, that will have vitamins and minerals added, such as B vitamins, for example. So there's two different kinds. Usually what we find out there in the wild is the fortified version. Either way, it's a good source of protein. It's a good source of vitamins and trace minerals. And it's a great source of umami flavor. So any questions about that? I know that was a lot to take in.
Marlene said that is also called brewer's yeast.
Brewer's yeast is different. So brewer's yeast is often used for lactation support in new moms. It has a completely different flavor from nutritional yeast. So I wouldn't use that in this recipe, but it is also edible and it's very high in nutrients as well. Just a different product. So yeah.
Correct. So there's a question here. So nutritional yeast cannot be used for baking.
Correct.
To make the dough rise. Yeah.
No, it does not. It is inactive. It doesn't have any live cultures or anything like that, even though it's called yeast.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a very
That's it.
confusing product.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's it for now.
Yeah. Okay, great. So we've got the cashews. Let's add the yeast. We're going to add some almond flour. So this is that regular almond flour. You can also use blanched slivered almonds, right? The ones that are kind of cut into like little moon shapes. That works too. So in goes the almond flour. And then we're going to add some garlic powder, about a tablespoon, and salt. So that's in here as well. And that's it. You're going to see this is going to go blend up in the food processor until it's kind of like a nice Parmesan texture. Sorry if there's a lot of background noise. Hopefully it's okay. And you don't want to go too long because eventually the nuts, in relationship to the heat of the blender, will start to release their oils and it's going to get a little sticky in there. So you just want to go until it looks just like Parmesan cheese. You can give it a little taste and sample it and see if it needs more salt or anything like that. But there you go. Essentially, you've made your own dairy-free umami cheese. So you can use this any way you would use Parmesan. It's, of course, going to go over our pasta. And any questions about this? Store it in the refrigerator, please. Store it in the refrigerator because there are ground nuts. So
No questions.
I'm going to show you what it looks like here. You can see it's like it's got the same texture, right, as Parmesan.
Beautiful.
Thanks, Alita. All right. So our final recipe, I just wanted to highlight tomatoes for a second, because tomatoes are a really, really great source of umami flavor. So you can use tomato paste in any kind of tomato related recipe that you're making, a casserole or some kind of even any kind of baked dish or soups or things like that. If you're using tomato paste, you're going to add that umami depth and kind of in that foundational layer, and that works out really, really well. So for this recipe, this is the easiest recipe on the planet. We're just going to use a little bit of butter. And I wanted to show you how when you brown butter, that brings out the umami flavor as well. So you can even get umami flavor from something that's not intrinsically umami. That's the lesson that I wanted to teach here. So like a tomato is intrinsically umami because it has the glutamates in it, but butter doesn't unless it's browned, right? So the browning of food is a really, really great way to bring that umami kind of to develop umami flavor. Does that make sense to everybody? I hope. Okay. Yes, no, maybe. All right, so let's get our pasta bowl ready. We're going to start dishing up. And for this tomato dish, you want to, of course, use the most beautiful, brightest tomato you can find on the planet. This is not that because it's not quite tomato season. So I'm hoping, soon we will have some nice tomatoes. But traditionally, tomatoes are just served with olive oil and salt. And I love that as much as the next person, but I just wanted to offer a way to kind of heighten the umami by adding the brown butter. Now, of course, brown butter is what I call a sometimes food. It's not something we're going to be eating every day. It's not, it's not on the approved health list for everybody, but a little bit, of brown butter is a nice, really nice flavor to play around with. And you really don't need a lot. So what you're going to notice with this is the butter is going to foam, and eventually it's going to start turning just a little bit dark, and you're going to smell, it's going to smell really nutty. So you can see over here, it's like bubbling and foaming. Not sure how well you can see that, but right there it is. You can see it's bubbling and foaming. It's still pretty white in color. We're just going to let it keep going a little bit longer. I'm going to slice up. These are some slightly nicer tomatoes. These are these little heirloom guys. I'm going to slice those up, add them to the plate. And this is just a nice little, kind of appetizer. And then another thing I really like to serve this with is smoked salt. So if you can find like a smoked salt, they sometimes have smoked Maldon salt at the grocery store. It's nice. It's, again, smoking developing umami. So anytime you smoke or brown things. So it stopped foaming. And now I'm starting to notice just a little bit of the browning, like the particles are starting to transform. And it's starting to look like almost like a caramel color. And just use your nose, right? Because it goes pretty quickly after it stops foaming. Smells really good, right? So once it starts to smell like this, I just want to show you the color of it. Maybe I can use something like this, right? So you can see it's now this beautiful, like brownish tan color. And that's it. We're just going to serve this over our tomatoes. Again, you really don't need much. We'll do a little sprinkle of beautiful smoked salt, and you'll see this is like an umami flavor bomb. So it's really a lot of fun to try, just try to enjoy something in a slightly different way. So there it is, right? And then we can plate up our pasta, and we're a few minutes early, so I'll take any questions. Otherwise, I'll talk to you about cashews and almonds and tomatoes and other things too.
There are a few questions. So, Chef
Sure.
Emily, how long will the vegan Parmesan keep in the refrigerator?
Great question. Thank you so much for asking that, because I actually wanted to mention it and then I forgot. So thank you. So the vegan Parmesan, it's nut based. So essentially there's no dairy in it. So it will last for quite a while. And I've had it in the refrigerator for 3 weeks and it's been fine. But, of course you want to enjoy things fresh if you can. So definitely, make a batch, and it also can be kept in the freezer. It keeps even longer in the freezer, up to 6 months. And then you can just kind of sprinkle it on your food whenever you're, ready to use it straight from the freezer. So either way it works. So freezer 6 months, fridge, I've done 3 weeks, but of course, food safety standards would say 5 to 7 days. So it does keep for quite some time. So there you have it. All right.
Chef
Any
Emily,
other questions?
yeah, there are a couple more. So is the umami
Sure.
of tomatoes why they're used in many Italian dishes?
So I can't necessarily say that that's why they're used, but I can say that they just have such a unique flavor, and that's because of the umami that people just gravitate towards them. And generally, people love tomatoes because generally people love things that have umami flavor. Yeah.
So when is the best time for tomatoes? I guess the season. What is the season for tomatoes?
Yeah, so it's coming up. Hopefully, if you've got a few tomato plants in your garden, they might start to have little fruits on them. But generally, I see local tomatoes. Some local farms actually have like a greenhouse and they can start their season earlier. So you might even start to see tomatoes in early July. But if you just grow them outside like we do here, we put our tomatoes in the ground from plant size. And that was in May, I think end of May. So we will probably get our tomatoes end of August, beginning of September.
Okay. There's a question. Is it tart tasting? It came in when you were doing the browning the butter.
Can you say that again? I'm sorry. I didn't quite understand.
The question is it tart, T-A-R-T, tasting? So I'm assuming they were talking about the butter because that's when the question.
No, no. Nothing. Umami is not a tart flavor. Umami is nutty. It's rich. It's kind of like that. It's anything that has that nice browning effect or anything like that. Like that's umami. So if you ever like bite it, it's also sometimes described as savoriness. So sometimes that helps people to get that. But yeah, it's certainly not tart. Browning butter just makes it really nutty and wonderful. So
that's it for the questions here, Chef Emily.
Great. Thank you so much, Alita. So with the time that we have left, just how you work with umami and what about MSG? I want to address those two things. So as you can see, how we worked with umami here, layer it in. Use vegetables that are in season. Add miso paste to sauces. Use soy sauce instead of salt. Use mushroom broths instead of water. Sprinkle your dishes with nutritional yeast anywhere that you would use cheese, or chop up some sun-dried tomatoes and tomato paste and add those things to recipes too. So that's really how you work with umami, is you kind of layer it in different stages. So here we have it in the broth. we have it in the mushrooms, and then we have it in the cheese on top of that, right? So it's really in stages. And then a little bit about MSG. So MSG stands for monosodium glutamate. And if you remember, umami in foods is primarily found in foods that contain a high level of glutamate. So glutamate is a naturally occurring amino acid in our food, and monosodium glutamate, also known as MSG, is a little bit different. So the body can't actually tell the difference between the glutamate in MSG and the glutamate in food. It's the same to our bodies. So to create MSG, because it's something that's created, generally sugar is fermented to create what's called glutamic acid. And then a sodium ion is added to make it a crystalline and stable. So when it's added to liquids, I'm gonna get a little bit food science nerd in this moment. When it's added to liquid, the bond between the sodium and the glutamate is actually broken, and that forms glutamate and sodium. So you have this MSG that is sugar that's fermented to create glutamic acid, then a sodium ion is added to that to make it stable. And then when that is added to, and that's, MSG in its form, and then when it's added to a liquid, it breaks apart. So the sodium and glutamate is broken, and you have the two in your food. So glutamate in MSG is the same substance found in our umami-rich foods. It's the same thing, but there's a lot of controversy as to whether or not it's okay, for you to enjoy. Some people say it gives them headaches or things like that. So I always encourage folks, make your own decision about whether or not MSG is something you would like to include. But just so you know, it's produced, but it's a naturally occurring thing in food. So I just wanted to kind of give you guys all the information. So now you can go out and make your own decisions about MSG. I certainly think that there's a really interesting article I think it was in the New York Times a while back, which I could send out to you all in this class afterwards, that makes you think a little bit more deeply about MSG. So I'll share that as well. Any questions or comments? I think our time is up. Pretty.
There was just someone who didn't get the recipes, so I stated that you had sent them, and that you normally send them again, or they can be accessed through the website, the Teaching Kitchen.
Yes, exactly. So I will send out recipes, of course, after class. Oh, and finally, I just wanted to say why we're focusing on plant-based umami, because umami is really easy to find and naturally occurring in all meats. So I wanted to give folks out there who are, looking for the satisfaction of that umami taste, because it's a really satisfying flavor. And, if you're trying to cut back on meat for whatever reason, whether it's heart health or environment or just your personal choice, I wanted to offer you a great way to bump up the flavor in your dishes, leveraging this umami taste and savoriness. So I hope this is helpful to everybody. Thank you so much for watching and sticking with us. And I hope you give these recipes a try. Certainly feel free to email if you have any follow-up questions or anything like that. And as always, Alita, thank you so much for moderating. Any final questions or comments? I think I just saw something pop up.
There is one. If you have expired regular yeast, can you use that as nutritional yeast?
No. So yeah, it's a completely different, even though they're both labeled as yeast, I wouldn't use it in that way. Yeah, it's not going to taste very good.
Yeah, and one last comment, that drinking water helps offset the sodium intake for preventing headaches.
Oh, okay, that's an interesting tip. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I haven't tried that myself, so probably in relationship to MSG, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for your participation, your sharing, and I look forward to hopefully seeing you again.